While he was in college at Carnegie Mellon University, Aron Ralston studied mechanical engineering, French, and piano, and then upon graduation, he moved to the Southwest and took a job as an engineer. But 5 years into his corporate job, he realized he hated it, and so he quit and moved to Colorado to pursue his real passion in life, which was mountain climbing. On April 25th, 2003, Ralston takes a trip to Utah where he plans to explore the Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9:15 a.m., he gets up, and it's this beautiful Saturday morning. He hops on his bike, and he bikes 15 miles to Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile gorge that at certain places was as narrow as 3 feet across. And so Aron locks up his bike and he begins walking through this canyon. About 6 hours later at 2:45 p.m., Aron is right at this section of the gorge that's getting really narrow, and below him is about 100 feet down to the bottom of the desert floor. He was going to walk with both feet on either wall because it was so narrow and kind of Spider-Man his way through this section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder became dislodged above him, and it comes tumbling down, and he barely gets out of the way, but it lands on his arm, and it pins his arm against the wall, and he can't move, and he's suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he's 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tries to pull his hand free and push the rock off, but it's not going anywhere. And that's when it dawns on him that he didn't tell anybody he was going to be in this gorge today. No one knows he's here, and he's so far away from anyone that can help him, and he doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a radio, he's got no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. Now, the position he was in was not him dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to position himself against the rocks where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit fairly comfortably besides his arm being crushed, and he was able to use the rock that actually had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. And after he calms down a little bit, after a few minutes, he reaches back and he pulls his bag out in front and he starts taking inventory of what he has. And all he had was 12 ounces of water, so just a single water bottle, and he had 2 burritos and some candy bar crumbs. That was all he had. In terms of tools, all he had was this crummy multi-tool, and it did have a little knife that extended off the end, and almost immediately he takes that multi-tool and begins chopping away at this boulder to try to see if he can maybe crack it and push half of it off. But he's finding out very quickly that it's completely futile. It is not moving. It is an enormous boulder. It's not going anywhere. He cannot possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set, Aron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off. But again, all he has is this multi-tool and this crappy little dull knife, and he's thinking there's no way I can cut through my arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone. And so very disheartened, he puts his multi-tool away and he begins to nurse the water and slowly eat the food and thinks maybe some miracle will happen where over the next couple of days, someone will be within earshot. I can yell to them and they can come get me, or maybe someone will see me when they're hiking overhead. I can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water. He was becoming delirious. He was actually drinking his own urine at this point, and he expected to die overnight. And so with his multi-tool, he etched his name into the rock, and then underneath it, he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. And then after that, he put his multi-tool down, and he did have a camera with limited battery, and he pulled that out, and selfie style, he filmed goodbyes to his family.
My name's Aron Ralston. My parents are Donna and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and fully expected to die. But he starts to have this really intense dream where he sees himself playing with a child and he's missing his right arm. And he takes that as a sign that he's supposed to chop his arm off and get out of here alive and go start a family. And so he wakes up from this dream and suddenly all he wants to do is survive. And he looks at his arm, which is already starting to decompose at this point, and he thinks to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm clean through? I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so he began testing using the edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm, using the torque of pushing it over the edge of the rock. And when he started to sense it was possible, he took a deep breath and then he broke his arm. He takes his multi-tool, and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm. Once his arm was free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he saw his arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And high on adrenaline, he climbed the 65 feet out of this canyon with his one arm. He gets to the trail and he runs 6 miles, and he happens to run into a group of hikers. They give him food and water and they're totally alarmed by him, but they're happy to help him. They call 911 and medics arrive and they save Aaron's life. Following Aron Ralston's rescue, they went back to retrieve his arm. But in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, and a winch, and all this heavy equipment, and they were barely able to move it. And they told Aron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment without killing you. So basically, you had to cut your arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And so for Aron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to feel like you cut your arm off and that was the right decision. They would take his arm and they would cremate it and give the ashes to Aron. And Aron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped, and he scattered his ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where James Franco plays Aron Ralston in the movie, and it's an incredible movie, albeit it's pretty hard to watch. Aron Ralston himself said the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary because James Franco does an incredible job portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath this boulder for 5 days. In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out, and his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road, and that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight-A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well-adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely, and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase, case taken, it was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account and he had taken all the money out but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm gonna come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, without a doubt, I know where Timothy is. He told them this story about how 10 years earlier, he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. And he didn't know what it was. It was wintertime, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who would show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him, and so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, if you've seen this guy, let us know, Steven's like, oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block. And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside of the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body, none. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice. In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift. So they were like, oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad. And he's like, no, I gotta go. I don't mind. And they're like, all right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work. And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. And his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay. You know, what's going on? Did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety. And it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not. So just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well. So she brings him to the doctor and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming. And eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night he would fall asleep and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them, before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything, and he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face, and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry, and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business, and it was about to get torn down, and some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer. So that's going to do it.
On the evening of November 27th, 2009, Michael Miller, or Big Mike as pretty much everyone knew him, was stomping around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine, studying his double-wide trailer and thinking through the new addition he was planning. Like his nickname suggested, 47-year-old Big Mike was a huge man, and he had a big bushy beard, and he looked right at home in this desolate rural setting. The trailer stood at the center of a snowy clearing along the edge of dark woods. There were no other buildings in sight, since Big Mike's closest neighbor lived almost 20 miles away. His hometown of Webster Plantation wasn't really a town at all. It had a population of 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and no streetlights. There had never really been much to do there, aside from, creek fishing and taking in the nature, and for a lot of people, working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee there for 29 years, but just 1 week ago, he'd been laid off. The loss of his job had stung, but he wasn't too worried. He and his wife Val lived frugally, and so they had enough cash stowed away to get by until he found another job. Big Mike was just about to head back inside when he heard a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pair of headlights sweep through the trees. Then a familiar white Ford Explorer came into view and pulled up to his mobile home. It was his 2 sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Mike Jr., the oldest son, was like a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike. But Matt was a lot different. He was skinny and pale, with a buzz cut and tattoos along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but was happy for the visit. So he walked up and gave them each a big hug and invited them inside. Then he called out to Val that the boys had stopped by for a visit, and within seconds, his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous coffee cakes in hand. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a birthday tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1. However, Matt still had not told anyone what the party plans were. Matt said they weren't really planning on doing anything, which Val immediately insisted was ridiculous. She said if Matt didn't want to plan something, well, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the party at their place. Matt tried to dissuade her, but finally just caved and agreed to let her host the party as long as it was small. Just immediate family, along with Mike Jr., Matt's girlfriend, as well as Mike Jr.'s best friend, Nate. The three of them were practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself and asked if Big Mike could step outside for a moment. Big Mike's jaw instantly tensed. He could guess where this was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt asked his father if he could borrow some money. Matt began talking about how he hadn't worked in months and was struggling with all the costs of a new baby. He couldn't even afford gifts or a cake for tomorrow. That's why they hadn't planned a party. When he finally finished his spiel, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake. He and Val would be happy to pick one up before the party. But he couldn't lend Matt money at the moment. For one thing, Big Mike told his younger son that he'd himself just been laid off from his job at the mill, so money was tight for him. And more importantly, he couldn't trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, but he did not push the issue. He just shook his head and headed back into the mobile home, where he asked if Mike Jr. was ready to go. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's Ford Explorer. Big Mike watched the SUV disappear into the forest, wondering if he had been too hard on Matt. Then he heard Val calling, and he turned to head back inside. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, so Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of Big Mike and Val's mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the snow toward the trailer. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a neighbor and friend of Big Mike and Val's. Alan had borrowed the gas can from Big Mike a few days earlier, and he was here now to return it. However, when he reached the trailer and knocked on the door, no one responded. Alan tried the door handle and found it was locked. Now, normally, Alan would have assumed that the Millers had just left to run an errand, but he looked and saw both of their vehicles were parked nearby. So he tried knocking again, and when he got no response again, he moved to the nearest window and peered inside. Tilting his head, he was able to make out what appeared to be homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall. There were also paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were getting ready for a party. But just then, he noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor. It took him a moment to realize what he was even looking at, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward. Because Big Mike and Val were both sprawled on the floor beside each other, not moving. Once Alan got over the initial shock, he rapped on the glass and called out to them, but they didn't move at all. Alan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and punched in 911. The moment the dispatcher picked up, Alan told them he'd just discovered the Millers unconscious in their trailer with the door locked. He asked if he should break in and try to help them, but the dispatcher told him that could be dangerous. Whatever caused the Millers to collapse could still be in there, whether it was an electrical problem or a carbon monoxide leak or something else. And so the dispatcher instructed Alan to simply wait until the authorities arrived, which unfortunately would take a while since the nearest police station was over 30 miles away. Alan was still waiting nervously outside the mobile home when he heard sirens approaching through the woods. An ambulance rounded a bend in the trees, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine. And they all pulled up in front of Alan, lights flashing. A police officer wearing a respirator mask told Allen to stand aside, and everyone waited while the firefighters tested the air around the door for carbon monoxide. When they announced that the coast was clear, the police forced open the door and entered the mobile home, followed by a pair of EMTs. And what they found, there in the kitchen, was Big Mike lying flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling, with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His wife Val was slumped by his side, with her head resting on his chest. Their skin was waxy and pale, they weren't breathing, and there was a small amount of blood on the floor around them. The EMTs checked for a pulse to be certain, but it was obvious the Millers were dead. And as soon as the EMTs looked more closely, it became clear what killed the Millers, and it was not carbon monoxide. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple, and a similar one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Allen continued to wait outside, watching the activity from a distance and calling everyone he knew to tell them about his awful discovery. At the same time, local police and medical personnel continued to arrive one by one until an entire fleet of law enforcement vehicles filled the clearing. Finally, about a half an hour after the EMTs first entered the mobile home, lead investigators Darryl Peary and Brian Strout of the Maine State Police arrived. The detectives stepped out of their car, quickly introduced themselves to Allen, and then said they had a few questions for him. They wanted to know how Allen knew the Millers and why he was visiting that morning. He told them about borrowing the gas can and said that Big Mike and Val were some of his favorite neighbors, as good-natured and helpful as you could find. He also mentioned that he'd been surprised to find the door locked when he arrived. People around here typically left their doors unlocked. The detectives collected Allen's contact information and then told him he could leave. After that, they headed inside. Detective Peary's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat everything was. When he got the call for 2 potential deaths at a trailer in the woods, he'd sort of half expected the place to be a cluttered mess, possibly even a drug den or meth lab. Instead, he found a tidy living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. This was a well-cared-for home. A very crowded home at the moment, since police officers were still busy photographing everything in sight. The detectives slipped through the crowd and made their way to the kitchen, where they found the medical examiner crouching over the Millers. Detective Strout leaned down close to examine the bullet hole in Val's right temple. As he did, Peary commented that there wasn't a lot of blood in the kitchen for a pair of gunshot wounds, and the medical examiner agreed, explaining that the murder weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun like a .22. The detectives perked up when they heard this, because they knew such a small gun like a .22 would most likely be used at very close range, and if Big Mike was shot up close from behind, it suggested one of two things. Either he had been held at gunpoint and executed, or he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and then turn his back on them. Just as they were figuring out which was more likely, a police officer hurried over and said they'd just found something the detectives would want to see. Strout and Peary followed this officer to a small room that was full of shelves. They were stocked floor to ceiling with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a small arsenal of firearms. Strout and Peary began walking through the room, pulling out random bins to check on the contents. They couldn't imagine what all this merchandise was doing here. But before they could figure it out, there was a commotion outside. The detectives went back to the living room and looked out the window at a young man in his late 20s flailing his arms in frustration while a sheriff's deputy blocked him from entering the front door. The man kept repeating that he needed to see his mother and father, until finally the deputy just said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man began to sob. Then he stumbled back to his truck, which was parked alongside all the other law enforcement vehicles. By the time the detectives reached the man, he was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, repeatedly trying to call someone on his cell phone. Strout and Peary introduced themselves to the young man, who replied that he was Mike Jr., the Millers' oldest son. They asked him why he had come to his parents' place, and he explained that he just heard from a friend that there was some kind of an accident at his mom and dad's place. And so he had rushed over as fast as he could, but he'd never expected to learn that both of his parents were dead. Mike Jr. said he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother, Matt. Mike wanted to be the one to break the news before Matt heard it from someone else, but unfortunately, Matt wasn't picking up. Now, Mike Jr. set his phone aside and turned to Strout and Peary. He had the look of a man who was in shock, but he said he wanted to help and then offered to tell them anything they wanted to know. The detectives asked him if there was any reason he could think of that somebody might want to hurt his parents. Mike Jr. said what most people say in this situation right after they lose a loved one. He said his parents were great people and everybody loved them. However, as he said this, a worried look came across his face, and he told the detectives that while his dad had worked at the mill, whenever times got tough, he would supplement his income with a lucrative side hustle, operating a pawn shop and loan shark business right out of his mobile home. He said his father also bought and sold prescription narcotics. The whole operation was unlicensed and totally illegal, but this far from civilization, most people didn't care. Big Mike had a long list of regular customers who would often stop by out of the blue. This information cast the murders in a whole new light for the detectives. Big Mike and Val weren't just some respected couple mysteriously gunned down in their family home. They were the owners of a shady illegal business that very likely could have turned their trailer into a revolving door of unsavory characters. And the detectives figured Big Mike must have had large amounts of cash on hand to run his loan business. Maybe a desperate individual who did business with Mike saw him as an easy target. Detective Strout was now itching to get back inside the mobile home and verify whether anything was missing. But first, he asked Mike Jr. when he last heard from his parents. Mike Jr. said he'd spoken to his mother around 10 a.m. that morning to firm up details for his niece's birthday party, which Big Mike and Val were supposed to host that afternoon at their mobile home. Mike also said it sounded like his parents weren't alone because when he spoke to her, he heard people talking in the background. And he actually recognized one of the voices as his cousin, a man who was named Clayton Giddon. The detectives made a note that Clayton Giddon could have been the last person to see the Millers alive. After they wrapped up with Mike Jr., Detective Strout called the state police headquarters to try to get background information on Clayton. At the same time, Peary went back inside the trailer. He wanted to get a second look at the storage room where Big Mike had been running his business. And when he got back there and looked around at the cluttered space, it was impossible to say for sure whether anything had been taken. That is, until Peary found an orderly stack of ledgers on a shelf. Flipping through these pages, it quickly became clear that Big Mike had kept meticulous records. Everything he'd bought or sold and every dime he lent was marked and dated. And from the information on these records, Peary could see that a safe where Mike stored jewelry and other high-value items was clearly missing. He also couldn't find one ledger book from the set, which looked like it was the one that was used to track Big Mike's loans. And so Peary was thinking more than ever that robbery had to be the motive for the murders when his partner, Detective Strout, came in to join him. Strout said he had just spoken to the office, who had given him an address for Clayton Giddon, Mike Jr.'s cousin. He was located in the nearby tiny town of Springfield. Strout told his partner that Clayton was apparently an avid hunter, which meant he very likely owned a lot of guns. Now, both detectives were even more eager to talk to him. Later that afternoon, when Strout and Peary knocked on Clayton's door, a young girl answered. She ran to get her father and returned moments later with a man in his mid-30s. Clayton was clearly shaken up, as though he'd already heard the news about his aunt and uncle's deaths. However, when the detectives told him that Big Mike and Val were murdered, Clayton seemed startled. And then he became even more distraught when he realized he was a potential suspect. But Detective Peary promised Clayton they were only there to talk. So Clayton took a few calming breaths, then he invited them into the living room. Clayton told the detectives that he'd driven out to have coffee with his aunt and uncle that morning, and he'd taken his 9-year-old daughter with him. When they arrived at their mobile home around 10 a.m., Big Mike and Val were at ease and looking forward to the birthday party later that day. There was no sign of any trouble, and the couple did not seem like they were in danger. Detective Strout listened patiently, while at the same time studying the man for any sign that he might be lying. but Clayton seemed genuinely shocked. And if his daughter really had been there that morning, Stroud had a hard time believing that Clayton was the killer. After all, who could commit murder in front of their own child? But suddenly, Clayton said something that made both detectives lean forward in their seats. He told them that he and his daughter were not the only ones at the Miller's place that morning. When they arrived, Big Mike and Val were already chatting with a young man named Nate Nightingale. Clayton didn't know exactly why Nate was there or what he was doing, but he said he didn't find it that unusual. Nate was Mike Jr.'s best friend, and he hung around the Miller's place all the time. But Clayton said the detectives should still talk to him because when Clayton left the trailer at 10:30 a.m., Nate was still there. Hearing this, Stroud and Peary could both feel the case starting to pick up speed. The Millers had been dead for only a matter of hours, but already the detectives had a potential witness who might have been in the room when the murders happened. When the detectives met at the state police office the following day, November 29th, they found new information waiting for them. The autopsy results had come in, and they confirmed that Big Mike and Val were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. This cemented the detectives' suspicions that they'd both been shot at close range, likely right there in their kitchen. The office had also pulled Big Mike's phone records, showing that he'd called a friend at 10:40 a.m. The detectives would contact this friend, and they would confirm that yep, Big Mike had called them, and during their conversation, nothing had seemed off. That left a narrow 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val could have been shot. Big Mike was very much alive at 10:40 a.m., but the couple was dead by 12:44 p.m. when Alan Richardson, the neighbor, had called 911. So Stroud and Peary got to work tracking down Nate Nightingale, perhaps the last known person to see the victims alive. But they were also eager to speak with Matt Miller, the younger son of Big Mike and Val, who still was not answering his phone. And as they would find out, Nate Nightingale and Matt lived right near each other. So the detectives set out to pay them each a visit. Matt's apartment was closer to the station, so Stroud and Peary headed there first. And from the moment Matt answered the door, the detectives could sense that something was just off. The 26-year-old had shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But it was actually Matt's behavior, not his appearance, that really got their attention. Matt was not acting like someone who just lost his parents. He didn't show signs of grief or even press the detectives for any details on the progress of the case. Instead, he seemed nervous and evasive, almost like he just wanted Stroud and Peary to leave as soon as possible. And the detectives responded to this behavior by actually pressing him on his whereabouts the previous day. He told them he had just been driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya and their infant daughter, picking up last-minute items for the birthday party that afternoon. Matt's alibi was short on details, and the way Matt refused to meet their eyes as he spoke made the detectives even more suspicious. And also, Tanya was out running errands with the baby, so she couldn't even confirm Matt's story. Stroud felt sure that Matt must be hiding something. So he tried asking about his relationship with Big Mike and Val. Was he on good terms with his parents? Matt brushed the question off, saying of course he was on fine terms with them. They were his parents. And then after that, no matter what the detectives asked, Matt gave similarly curt responses. It eventually became clear the detectives were not going to get much more from him today. So they got a cell phone number for Matt's girlfriend, Tanya, and told him they'd follow up soon. And then they left to go talk to the next person on their list, Nate Nightingale. After their interview with Matt, speaking to Nate was like a breath of fresh air. From the moment Nate answered the door, he was polite and eager to help. Nate was clearly upset and told the detectives that he'd been close to the Millers for years. He had been best friends with Mike Jr. since high school, and he considered the Millers' trailer like his second home. Detective Peary asked Nate what he had been doing at the Millers' trailer on the morning of their murders. Nate said that he dropped by to catch up and also to take out a small loan from Big Mike. They'd just wrapped up business when Big Mike's nephew, Clayton Giddon, had arrived with his daughter. Nate said that Clayton left at 10:30, and then Big Mike took a phone call shortly after that. And then after Mike got off the phone, Nate said his goodbyes. To this point, Nate's story about what happened that morning matched all the details the detectives already knew from speaking to Clayton and also looking over Big Mike's phone records. But then, Nate revealed something they had not expected. Nate said that as he was leaving, a woman arrived at the Millers' trailer. He said he'd never seen her before, but she looked like she was in her 50s, maybe around 5'4" tall, with a slender build and glasses and bangs. He said she had called out, "Hi, Val," as she entered the mobile home, and she greeted Nate as he was leaving. His best guess was that she was a customer, but she could have just been a friend. At that point, Nate said he drove off to meet up with his girlfriend, so he didn't know how long that woman had stayed at the trailer. The detectives got the feeling like things were speeding up again. They now had someone who was at the trailer during the 2-hour window when the shooting occurred. The detectives knew they had to speak to this woman, but they had to find her first. Strout and Peary told Nate that a department sketch artist would be in touch very soon to put together a sketch of this mysterious woman. And sure enough, by the time the two detectives were back at the office, they found that the artist and Nate had already linked up, and the sketch was complete. Looking at the sketch, the detectives thought this woman looked like she could be anyone. But there weren't a lot of people in this part of Maine to begin with, so if this woman was a local, there was a decent chance somebody would recognize her. On December 1st, 2009, so 3 days after the Millers' murder, the detectives hosted a press conference where they officially disclosed what many people already knew. The Millers' deaths had been ruled a double homicide. Then, they also released the forensic sketch of the mystery woman, saying she was an important person of interest in the case. Anyone who recognized her was encouraged to call the investigators as soon as possible. Right after the press conference, police posted copies of the sketch all over town, while others went door to door asking if anyone knew the woman. And soon, calls started to come from people all around the state who said they did recognize her. The detectives were just starting to look into these tips when Matt Miller's girlfriend, Tanya, finally returned their call from 2 days ago. They asked her where Matt had been on the morning of the murders, wondering if she would confirm Matt's claim that she'd spent the morning driving around with him looking for gifts. But instead, Tanya insisted she had not been with Matt at all that morning. She said on Saturday morning, Matt had walked out the door without saying where he was going. And for the next 2 hours, nobody could reach him, which was extremely frustrating considering they were supposed to be getting ready for their daughter's birthday party that afternoon. She said he finally returned around noon, but refused to say where he'd been. The detectives were astonished. Matt had clearly lied to them, and his own girlfriend was now saying that she herself didn't know where Matt was during the time of the murders. They considered driving over to pick Matt up for questioning, but decided to hold off until they could gather more information. The detectives already knew Matt had a criminal record. There was an outstanding arrest warrant out for him for writing bad checks. But now, Strout and Peary wondered if he might be involved in more illegal activity. For the next 3 days, the detectives quietly contacted people throughout the area, pressing for information about Matt. And what they learned was that Matt was clearly addicted to prescription drugs and had recently begun selling personal items, including his own Xbox, so he could buy more. And Matt's older brother, Mike Jr., had told them that Matt had asked his father for a loan on the night before the murders, when the brothers had dropped by. Big Mike had apparently turned him down, most likely because he knew Matt would simply blow the money on drugs. But the most damning tip of all didn't have anything to do with Matt's addiction or his criminal past. A local resident told the detectives they'd seen Matt's white Ford Explorer in the vicinity of his parents' house on the morning of the murders. This was something Matt had never disclosed to the police, and it potentially put him at the scene during the 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val were murdered. At this point, Strout and Peary knew it was time to talk to Matt again. They were not quite ready to charge him with his parents' murders, but the facts were quickly stacking up against him. So on December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on that outstanding bounced check charge and brought him in for questioning. Once they put him in a room, they pushed him hard, telling him they knew he killed his parents. And Matt just denied everything, while at the same time becoming increasingly emotional. But after hours of intense interrogation, Matt stuck to his story that he never would hurt his parents, and even the detectives started to wonder if they had it wrong. So they ultimately sent Matt back to a holding cell and then stepped out of the interview room to regroup. And that's when they got a tip that reassured them they were on the right track. A local man called to say that on the evening before Big Mike and Val were killed, Matt had called him up looking to buy a gun. He even specified he wanted a .22 caliber pistol, which, according to the autopsy, was the type of gun used to commit the murders. The man said the firearms sale had not gone through, but the detectives figured Matt still could have kept on looking and eventually gotten his hands on a .22. With this new tip, the detectives marched back into the holding cell where Matt sat on his bed and told him what they'd learned. Matt immediately insisted that the tip was false, saying he never tried to buy a gun that night. But the stress of the interrogation was clearly wearing on him, and finally he broke down and confessed. Not to murdering his parents, but to lying about his alibi. He said that on the morning of the murders, he was meeting with a drug dealer not far from his parents' place. He bought some pills and then went into the woods to take them. He later lied about it because he didn't want to incriminate himself and because he was ashamed that he was off getting high while he was supposed to be getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. Strout and Peary were skeptical of Matt's tearful confession, especially after all the lies, but they agreed to check out his new alibi and see if there was any truth to it. The detectives began by pulling security camera footage from businesses along the route Matt said he took. It was a very tedious process that took 2 full days, as the detectives scrubbed hours of footage looking for Matt's white Ford Explorer. Strout's eyes were starting to glaze over when Peary suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pointed at the screen. The footage showed a familiar car traveling away from the Miller's place at 11:25 a.m. on November 28th, the morning of the murders. The detectives stared at the grainy footage, slowly realizing what this meant. The footage conclusively showed that the car's driver had lied about their alibi and had been close to the trailer around the time the crime was committed. Strout and Peary leapt into action. They sent officers out to bring that driver in for questioning. But before the arrest warrant could ever be drawn up, Peary's phone rang. He answered it, and there was a woman on the line. Peary did not recognize her voice, but she told him she had vital information about the Miller's case. For a moment, Peary was ready to write this off as just another bad tip. He and Strout had been fielding calls all week from people who claimed to recognize the mystery woman from the forensic sketch, and every one of those calls had been a dead end. But this one was different. The caller didn't mention the mystery woman at all. Instead, she said she actually knew who killed Big Mike and Val. And as the detectives listened to her story, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, security camera footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael and Valerie Miller on the morning of November 28, 2009. Early that morning, the killer was home in their apartment, rifling through drawers in search of something, anything, that they could quickly turn into cash. They'd already pawned or sold their video game console, DVD player, and sound system, along with pretty much everything else of value. Now they were broke again and getting desperate. Suddenly, their hand closed around a metal grip. They pulled the object from the drawer, and they felt a rush of exhilaration as they stared down at the .22 caliber pistol in their hand. It wasn't what they'd initially planned to sell, but this gun could get them all the cash they needed. A few hours later, the killer was standing in the Miller's mobile home, talking to Big Mike in the kitchen. After their desperate morning search, the killer finally felt calm. Finally, the conversation with Big Mike moved past chit-chat to business. The killer pulled the pistol from their jacket and held it out, asking how much Big Mike could offer for it. The killer wasn't here to shoot Big Mike. They had come to pawn the gun. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, then gave his answer. The killer blinked, then shrugged and nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It was less than they had hoped for, but probably a fair offer for the tiny pistol. Big Mike handed the gun back over and said he would need to grab his business ledger from the storage room, and then he turned, but before Mike took a single step, the killer's finger brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Big Mike's examination, and the gun went off. The killer jumped from surprise as Big Mike collapsed, his enormous body slumping to the floor of the kitchen. Val screamed and rushed into the room, instantly dropping to her husband's side. In an instant, the killer realized what they'd just done. They had shot Big Mike in the head. Maybe Val would believe this was an accident. Maybe she wouldn't. But right now, all the killer wanted was for her screaming to stop. Without really understanding why, the killer raised the gun and fired, this time on purpose. Val's scream was cut short as a bullet hit her in the head, and she collapsed onto her husband. The killer just stared down at the crumpled bodies, horrified by what they'd just done. The situation felt so unreal, but as the seconds ticked by and Big Mike and Val didn't move, the killer knew they were dead. Then, the killer realized that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would need to get out of the mobile home right now. And they were about to flee when a thought suddenly struck them. They came here for money, and Big Mike would not be needing money anymore. Besides, it might be good for the killer if the police thought the shooting was part of a robbery. So, the killer ran for the storage room. They threw the door open and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the guns and electronics. The killer knew they couldn't carry very much, so they decided to take the safe. Before leaving, the killer stopped to consider Big Mike's business ledgers. They knew these books would include the sizable loans the killer had taken out from him in the past. And this made the killer nervous. So the killer quickly flipped through the pages of the ledger books until they found one containing their own name. They tucked that ledger under their arm, picked up the small but heavy safe, and left the storage room. They avoided looking at the bodies on the kitchen floor as they shuffled past, and they just continued to drag the safe out of the mobile home back to their car. Before leaving, they doubled back to lock the trailer's door. With any luck, that would delay the bodies from being discovered, and hopefully buy the killer a bit more time. A few minutes later, the killer was speeding away, and they were so focused on just getting out of town that they didn't notice the closed-circuit cameras aimed at the road. When Detective Strout and Detective Peary reviewed the camera footage 2 weeks later, they didn't see the white Ford Explorer they were looking for, because Matt Miller was not the killer. It was Nate Nightingale, the best friend of Mike Jr., who the Millers had treated almost like a third son. The woman who had called in with a hot tip was Nate's girlfriend, and she told Strout and Peary that Nate had come to her and confessed to the crime. Nate was arrested on December 12th, and shortly after that, he would admit to everything. He said he really had gone to the Miller's place intending to pawn the gun. He needed the money so he could go Christmas shopping with his girlfriend. But while he was showing the gun to Big Mike, it went off by mistake, and when he realized what he had done, he panicked and intentionally killed Val. Nate also admitted to fabricating the story about the mystery woman. He said she was just a red herring to keep the police off his tail. She didn't exist. Detective Strout and Peary didn't like to admit this, but Nate's ploy almost worked. The search for that mystery woman burned up a lot of their time, and if they hadn't stumbled upon the security camera footage of Nate's car, it might have saved him. But now that they knew the truth, they looked at the forensic illustration again, and they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the sketch looked shockingly similar to Nate Nightingale himself, down to the narrow face, thin nose, and glasses. Nate had intended to throw the police off his trail with this mystery woman, but as he gave them details for the sketch, he sort of subconsciously wound up describing himself. It was almost like his guilt over murdering the people who helped raise him was so great, he could not let himself get away with it. Nate was sentenced to 40 years in prison for murdering Val. Big Mike's death was treated as manslaughter, for which Nate received 15 years to be served concurrently. Big Mike and Val's sons, Mike Jr. and Matt, sat stone-faced at the sentencing, while Nate tearfully apologized for destroying their family. Neither brother responded, but they stayed and watched while he was led away in handcuffs. Ever since, the two brothers have celebrated Matt's daughter's birthday a week early so that on November 28th, they can also remember their parents.
On the evening of June 17, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and two kids in suburban Texas.
It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so, after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out looking out the window, but eventually she kind of snapped out of it, she gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son, Caleb, hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband, Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other. And next to them was their 1-year-old daughter sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along. And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so, with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so ultimately the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son, because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own, but Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad, and so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related, and so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together, and then afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed, and then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer, and so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard the sound of their front door open and then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on and leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her, and so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that, and so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing, and so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6 a.m., she rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed, she made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there, and so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm, stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car. She jumped inside, she turned it on, she peeled out of the driveway and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side, and she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son, he's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road, she throws it in park, she gets out and runs to the nearest police officer and begins frantically asking them, what's happened here? What's happened? And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is. And the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay? The officer told her to please calm down. We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything. But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers. And so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there, she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, both women are totally hysterical, but they run right up to the police tape, and they look down in the direction of where this fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. And immediately, when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car. Or I should say, she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of the vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. And so between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have, along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat, it was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends in Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly in Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay, she still very much appreciated the effort that people were making to comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being, there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle save for the frame. And also Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from the crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. It would turn out there was lighter fluid found all over the front seat of the car, so that was the reason the fire had gotten so big. And then during the autopsy, Clay's lungs showed that he had not ever inhaled any soot, meaning he was dead when the fire started. And so very likely, Clay was murdered and the car accident was staged. And interestingly, when word started to get out in town that Clay's death seemed suspicious and that maybe he was murdered, it turned out nobody was surprised. Because even though Molly adored Clay and thought he was a great father, most other people in Leander hated him. He was known around town to be this totally short-tempered guy who would just pick fights with people out of the blue. In fact, at Clay's own funeral, his literal best friend stood up to eulogize him, and during this, he said, "I think honestly, the world is a better place without Clay." And so investigators began looking into Clay's background to see if they could find connections with people that might have a grudge or some reason to be mad at Clay who might want to do him harm. And very quickly, investigators found something. Just 10 days before Clay was found, he had pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. But the sentence he received was incredibly light. He was given 30 days in jail, which he had not served yet, and probation. Now, the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's light sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So investigators quickly tracked down this father, and they brought him in for questioning, but very quickly this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay, yes, he had threatened to kill Clay, but no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay. And the father had an alibi to back that up. And so after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect, but he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also at the same time very, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally, she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve. And so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up, they left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious, and it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to, and Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly nonstop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible. And Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned, after talking to Molly's neighbors, that Molly was starting to date again already. Just 3 weeks after her husband has died, she's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her 2 kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old, who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional, and periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy!" But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, really, you should get your son some help here, Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine, it was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him or how he died and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death. And so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work. Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed, and they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize, with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window, and then at some point, Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her, and then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so the undercover police officer followed after them, and eventually the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food, and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seen anything incriminating happening here, but what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious, and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot, and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles, and they casually walked into the Taco Bell, and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with. Something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, all right, we're doing something here. The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise, and the officer just stared down at the guy. Not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was someone he knew personally from being in law enforcement in the area. This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so that was why there was no skid marks up on the road, because again, this was not a car accident, it was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. They were questioning how he died, but nobody really thought it wasn't Clay. And so their plan was working. But after 3 weeks of being apart, with Clay kind of hanging out by himself away from the town, Clay and Molly just couldn't stand to be apart any longer. And so Clay dyed his blonde hair black. That was the only thing he did to disguise his identity. And then he just moved back into the home with Molly and the kids. And so that was the new boyfriend that neighbors were seeing Molly with. She was not actually going out on new dates. she was just back with Clay. And Clay's stepson, Caleb, the 4-year-old, he immediately recognized that his father was back, even though he had black hair. But Molly and Clay had convinced the little boy that Clay was not really Clay. Instead, this was the new boyfriend, Jake. This is very likely why Caleb had begun acting out. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but not old enough to understand that his parents were lying to him. It's unclear why Molly and Clay, who lived together shamelessly, decided to have this weird rendezvous in the parking lot inside of Clay's Mustang and then go to Taco Bell and eat together. But regardless, it was this secret meetup that ultimately led to them getting caught. Molly and Clay were both charged with insurance fraud, and they both pled guilty. Molly was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Clay was sentenced to 30 years in prison plus 20 more years for probation violations. Molly has since been paroled, while Clay is still in jail.
In 2014, a 16-year-old girl living in the UK was home one night with her mom, and she was in her bedroom and she was flipping through her phone when she gets a text message. The message was coming from a boy she had recently met via Snapchat. He told her to go to her window and look outside because he was right near her apartment. Now, this girl did not know this boy particularly well, so it was very creepy to be told, "I'm on your property." But either way, she went to the window to look. There's no one out there. And it's late, so she can't really tell if maybe he's hiding or something. But she feels really creeped out by this, and she ends up leaving her bedroom and going into her mother's room and tells her mom, "Hey, I'm gonna sleep in here with you tonight." She doesn't tell her mom about the text message. Maybe she was embarrassed. We don't know. So the girl is laying in bed, her mom's asleep, and as she's about to put her phone down and actually go to sleep, she gets another text from this boy.
"I'm in your house."
She immediately wakes her mom up. She shows her mom. Her mom's like, "Oh no." She jumps out of bed. Every light goes on. Runs downstairs to confront this person who's apparently in their apartment, but he's not there. The mother ultimately decides, after not finding anything, that, he's not here. We didn't hear anybody come in the house. The doors are locked, everything's locked. So they did another sweep through the apartment and checked every entrance, locked everything. Let's just go to bed. So they go back into the mother's bedroom, shut and lock the door, and the two of them go to sleep. The next morning, the mother is still sleeping. The girl wakes up a little bit early and she decides to go into her bedroom. As soon as she walked in, she would later tell reporters that immediately she felt like she was being watched. And so she starts doing a cursory check of her small bedroom. She, pulls the door aside, looks behind the door. She opens her closet, pulls her clothes aside, looking around, there's no one in there. And she's thinking to herself, that boy got to my head and I'm psyching myself out. She looks down at her bed, and she used to keep all of her shoes lined up next to her bed. And she was really OCD about how she organized her shoes. And she noticed that one set of shoes was out of place. It was a subtle thing that really only she would be able to recognize. And so she gets down on her knees to rearrange the shoes, and that's when she sees something out of the corner of her eye. Her bed was slightly elevated, and so she had a little bit of a line of sight under the bed as soon as she was kneeling. And under the bed is a face, and it's the face of the boy who had said, "I'm outside your house," and he's the same one who said, "I'm in your house." And he's smiling up at her, and he's clutching his phone, looking at her. She runs out of the room. She runs to her mom's room and says, "He's in there, he's in there." The mother comes barreling in, protective mama coming in. The boy's out from under the bed. The boy, in a panic, runs to the window, pulls it open, and jumps out of the window. The boy would turn out to be Kyle Ravenscroft, and he had very quickly become obsessed with this girl. And he just wanted to be close to her. And so when she got that text message that was, "Hey, come look out your window," he was hiding. And when she went into her mom's room, he could actually see her go into the mom's room, and he climbed up the side of the apartment into the window that was open, shut it, and climbed under the bed, so that when the mother and the daughter were searching the house, he was already in the house. So they locked him into the house. He was ultimately given a very small sentence. I think it was a couple weeks in jail, a fine, and some community service. But no matter what the sentence was, I'm sure that girl will have to deal with the trauma of that event for the rest of her life. In 2014, a couple came back to their house in Seattle, Washington, and found it absolutely destroyed, but in totally baffling ways. All of their shoes that had the soles inside of the shoe ripped out. Someone had taken a big can of paint, taken the lid off and flipped it upside down on the top of the toilet. Their mail had been ripped to pieces and it was laying all over the ground. Their clothes had been ripped out of all the drawers. There was this piece of wood that they didn't know where it came from that had a single screw screwed into it that had been wedged between a door and the door frame, but it wasn't blocking it from opening. It was just like someone wedged it in the middle of the door for some reason. There was hand lotion all over the door handles of some of the doors in their house. There was also a purse sitting on their bed that had the ID card of a 27-year-old woman who they didn't recognize. The couple does a quick look around, but is worried someone might still be there, so they leave and they call the police. The police show up and they're just as confused as the couple because nothing was stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. It was just like someone came in there and wrecked the house and then left. It was very confusing. And so ultimately the police just went back to their precinct to write up the report and told the couple, hey, lock your doors and, be on the lookout for someone trying to rob you again. After the police left, the couple began cleaning up the mess inside of their house. And after a couple hours of doing that, they decided, we'll finish this up tomorrow. They're laying in bed and they start hearing this sound that sounds like an animal dying coming from underneath their bed. Now, they didn't think this could be a person because there was almost no space underneath their bed. It was, barely any clearance under their beds. They're thinking an animal must have gotten in here. We had the doors wide open as we were cleaning stuff out. Maybe an animal got in here. They're like, no, we're not going to deal with this. They jump up and run out of the bedroom and call the police again. Police show up, they go into the bedroom, and there is a person underneath their bed, 90-pound, 27-year-old crazy woman who was high on meth, carrying a knife and a hypodermic needle. And she was under there burrowing a hole underneath the bed. She was the same woman that was on that ID card in the purse that they had found earlier. Her story was she climbed up the tree that was outside the window and jumped into the second floor window while the couple was gone. She ransacked the house for reasons we don't understand and then went under the bed. And there was so little clearance under the bed that the couple did not think to look under there for people. So that whole time they were cleaning up, she was still in the house. Luckily, she didn't get all the way through. Who knows what she would have done if she'd actually punctured all the way through. In 2017, a young college girl who was living alone in an apartment started to notice that something didn't feel right. In the morning, she'd get up and she'd open her fridge, and some of the food that she would leave in there, it appeared like there was less of it. A couple times she would wake up and she'd walk out into her living room and one of the pillows would be in a different position or had even fallen off the couch. There was just little things happening in her apartment that collectively was actually pretty unsettling and was starting to scare her. And she started having these nightmares at night that someone was breaking into her apartment. One night, she wakes up from one of those nightmares and she's drenched in sweat. She decides she's going to take a shower before she goes back to sleep. She goes to her bathroom and she brings her phone. She would play music while she was taking a shower. She would put her phone right up against the window that was next to the shower curtain so at any time she could reach over, change the song, and then keep showering. She had a very old door on the bathroom where there was actually a key on the inside of the door that if you wanted to, you could actually lock the door and then take the key out, and the only way to open it again, even from the inside, is with that key. So she's taking her shower, she's listening to music, and at some point she wants to change the song. And so she pulls the shower curtain back just enough to reach her hand out to touch next on her phone when she stops. The phone was reflecting something in the middle of her bathroom. And it was a dark figure standing in her bathroom, shoulders squared up to the actual shower. So someone is standing in the middle of her bathroom facing her right now. I don't know how she did this, but she stayed composed. She retracted her hand, turned the water all the way to scalding hot. She took the shower head out, and once the water was so hot there was steam all over the bathroom, in one fell swoop, she ripped open the curtain and sprayed the water directly on the face of the person standing right there next to her. She runs past this person who's now clutching their face and screaming in pain. She grabs the key on her door on the inside, locks it, takes the key out, runs out of her bathroom, slams it behind her, locking the intruder in the bathroom. The girl runs into her kitchen to get her butcher knife. She had one nice knife, but when she went into the kitchen, her one butcher knife, she couldn't find it. She ditches the idea of getting a knife and instead grabs a towel and runs out of her apartment. She makes it outside. She calls the police. The police show up. The girl gives them the key to the bathroom. They go into her apartment and they unlock the bathroom and they pull this person out. It was this crazy lady who used to live at this apartment, and she had apparently made copies of the keys and had been sneaking in whenever this girl wasn't there, or at night she would sneak into her apartment and she would sleep there on the couch and then leave before the girl woke up. So as the police bring this woman away, one of the officers breaks off and goes over to the girl who owns the apartment, and he holds up an evidence bag, and it's the girl's butcher's knife. The woman had taken it from the kitchen and was standing in the bathroom waiting for her to get out of the shower. And the officer just says, looks like she wanted her apartment back. In 1981, a 9-year-old boy discovered that if he was really quiet, he could sneak out of his bedroom at night, go down into the kitchen, and eat as much junk food as he wanted. One night in the summer that year, his family went out for this huge dinner at this amazing restaurant, and when they came back, they had all these leftovers. And the boy really wanted to eat the remainder of the sweet and sour pork. He was really excited about it. So everyone goes to bed, and he's really deliberate. He starts sneaking down the stairs, being ultra careful. He gets to the end of the stairs, hasn't made a sound. And that's when he freezes because he hears what sounds like a fork making a little clinking sound against the counter. And he thinks, my parents have got to be in there. And if they see me, I'm going to be totally busted. So I don't want them to see me. And so he begins to turn his head around the corner because he was obscured by the wall. And he pokes his head just far enough in to where he can see into the kitchen. And standing in the middle of the kitchen is this skinny man that he's never seen before, drinking milk directly from the carton with the fridge wide open. The kid holds back a scream, sneaks back up the stairs. When he finally gets upstairs, he runs into his parents' room and he tells them what's going on. The father runs downstairs, ready to confront whoever's there. There's no one there. There's not even a sign that anyone was there. So they look everywhere and they can't find anything. And so the parents don't believe him. And everybody goes back to bed, and that's that. The boy was very confident at what he saw. Although he did feel like, I guess I could have imagined it, but he started paying really close attention to everything in his house. In the mornings, he would go downstairs before everybody else and he would see if there was any sign of someone having been in the kitchen. He noticed at one point that the napkin holder had been moved to the wrong side of the counter. He also noticed one time there was a mug that was in the sink that no one had used the night before. And so he's thinking that someone is sneaking into our house. I don't know how, I don't know where, but I'm confident that it's still happening. But his parents didn't believe him. 3 months after the boy has seen this person in his kitchen, he's in his bedroom, he's just laying there, and he's looking up at the vent on his ceiling, an air conditioning vent. And as he's looking at it, he sees a pair of eyes go over the vent looking down at him. And they blink, and he can tell it's eyes looking at him. It takes him a second to process it, but he freaks. Runs out of his room, runs to his parents' room, and he can barely talk. He's like, there's someone in the vent. The parents run into his room, they check crawl spaces, the attic, they're shining a light into the vent. They can't find anything. And so once again, it turns into, you're making this up, you have an overactive imagination, there's nothing going on in this house. But a week goes by, and their house started to smell really bad. And the majority of the stink was coming from that vent in the boy's room. And even worse, there were maggots falling out of that vent. So they got the air conditioning people over to have a look, and they were totally confident that what they were going to find is a dead animal up inside the vent. But that's not what they find. They find a dead man who had been living in their ceiling. There was literally a cot that had been set up inside of their ceiling. There were drawings of this boy taken from the perspective of looking down at him through the vent. Someone had been living in their ceiling over the boy's bed for months and then died up there. The man was never identified and was buried at John Doe. And I'm sure the parents felt really bad about not believing their son. In 2013, a young woman was living alone in an apartment and she was on the phone with her boyfriend. As she's chatting with her boyfriend, she decides to go get her mail. She walks into the main hall to this area where all the mail slots are on the wall. She's chatting, she opens up her slot, she gets her mail, shuts her slot, and then she walks back down the hall to her apartment, opens the door, goes back in, and she goes to her bedroom. And she's sitting on her bed, feet on the floor, and she's got her phone, and she kind of tucks it against her shoulder, and she's rifling through her mail. And as she's flipping through her mail, the phone drops. And the way that it lands is it kind of bounces backwards underneath the bed. She puts her mail in the bed, and she gets down on her chest to extend her arm out to get her phone that's now well under the bed. And as soon as she starts looking for the phone, she freezes and she stifles a scream. There's a man in the fetal position tucked against the far side underneath the bed, not looking at her. The girl stays composed. She gets her phone. She goes, "Hey, I'm going to take a quick shower. Let me call you right back." With her phone in hand, she walks right out, goes into her bathroom, which is right next door, shuts it, locks it, turns on the shower, opens her window, and jumps out. She was on the first floor. Goes right across the street and hides behind a car, and she calls the police. The police show up, they go inside, and they bring out this crazy, deranged-looking man. As they're taking him away in handcuffs, one of the officers comes over to her, and he says to her, you're very lucky you did what you did, because we found him in your apartment standing outside of the bathroom holding a knife. He was waiting for you. The girl believes that when she went to get her mail, she was distracted because she was talking to her boyfriend, and she must not have shut her apartment door, at which point this guy must have snuck in and gotten under her bed. The man was committed to a mental institution, and the girl's boyfriend moved in with her the next day.
It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was backbreaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar, and he headed into this shut down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting, and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it. And then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt. And then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot, he couldn't have breathed. breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the Kayak Molding Company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined £200,000. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined £25,000 and sentenced to jail for 9 months. On the evening of October 28, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation, and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you, I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then, because they figured, okay, well maybe she left early and she came home from work early, and so we just kind of missed her on both ends, and that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning, we haven't seen her now, we don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old, and if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now, and in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work, because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing, we don't know where she is, she might have gotten kidnapped, come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house, and when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37, I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police, and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case, and so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marisa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marisa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy, she was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marisa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marisa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marisa's room. And so Gina, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. I mean, this room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf, and she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marisa Weber on October 28th, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marisa had come home, she saw her mom and dad in the kitchen, she was offered food, she turned it down and said, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. She went upstairs, she went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marisa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that, and then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marisa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marisa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marisa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau, and she reached back behind this 6-foot-tall bookcase, and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug, but when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marissa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention, and so eventually she died. Marissa's family would say when they were looking for Marissa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house, and so they didn't know it was actually likely Marissa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marissa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marissa decomposing, but the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space, and so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th when Marissa's sister, Gina, was back in Marissa's bedroom and she looked over at the bookcase and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister. On the night of May 29th, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, it was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly looking for scrap metal to sell and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar, because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got. And he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing, and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having, and then one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song. Another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and get to know these people. One, because Robalito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robalito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robalito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robalito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, "Hey, we want another round of drinks." And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, "Thank you very much." And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away, it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, "Keep it up, you're doing great." And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note, and when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, like obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm. And so right away, the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, "We knew you were going to screw this up. This was a bad choice." And Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer, and now the bouncer had his beard down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, "What are you doing?" But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer, and all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito, the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered, and he hated the song to begin with. And in fact, ironically, Robolito had been hired by that karaoke bar specifically to keep the peace if the song were to come on. But as he listened to this song, something happened inside of him, and he pulled his gun and shot and killed Romy.
Broadcast channel still on. Blue lights glow inside the control room. Data streams run quietly by. The city sleeps inside motion. Only signals keep me alive. Screens are breathing in soft flickers. A strange line just appeared tonight. No one speaks it out in words yet, but the air's changed its light.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories just like